Why do we like warm pads more than any other kind in worship music? Is it possible for a pad to sound cold? What does it really mean to have a warm pad sound? We're going to explore all of this in today's video and quantify what makes a pad sound warm. So the next time you need a warm pad sound for your own worship team, you'll know just where to go. Let's check it out. Hey guys, David from Sunday Sounds here, where our focus is making it easy for anybody to find success in the worship keys position at their church. If you're a worship leader or the worship keys player at your church, subscribe to the channel because we put out new videos all the time to help you level up your keys rig. Today we're going to be demystifying one of the most popular buzzwords across all of modern worship music. We're going to talk about the word warm, and specifically the word warm applied to a type of pad sound. Warm pad is probably the most commonly requested type of sound that folks come to us here at Sunday Sounds looking for, and we wanted to break down what makes a pad sound warm and what doesn't. So when you're looking for pads of your own or you're creating pads yourself, you have a basic understanding of the ingredients that actually define it as such. We're going to talk today about 3 characteristics that you can use to define a pad sound as warm. I'm going to list all 3 of them right now, and then we'll go through each one at a time and break it down a little bit more. So first off is frequency range, where it sits in the audible frequency range that we can hear as the listener. Second is the character or the timbre of the sound itself. What does the instrument producing those frequencies sound like? And then third is the spatialization of the sound. Now that's a big fancy word for saying how big, how wide, how complex or not complex does a sound feel. Now, spatialization is often used in the production world to talk about the stereo field and how wide or narrow the sound can be. And that can be a factor when it comes to talking about pads, but it doesn't have to just be about stereo image. It's also about how dense or complex a sound is. So to start off with, I'm gonna open up MainStage here. I've got Sunday Keys open, but you're going to be able to follow along in any software that you'd like. What I want to do first off is just open up Omnisphere 2 from Spectrasonics, which is an absolutely phenomenal plugin. If you don't own Omnisphere 2 and you can afford to, you're missing out. It is an incredible synth plugin that I highly recommend. We love here at Sunday Sounds. Omnisphere has an incredible selection of vintage analog sound sources. So I'm gonna go here and just search for Juno, and we'll go down here to pads. And let's just hear an example of a pad that was captured from a Roland Juno synth. In this patch, I happen to be able to increase the filter cutoff with the mod wheel. So it's just a beautiful synth. I'll bring up another one here. This is a pulse width modulation pad, also sampled from the classic Juno. This one gets super big. So both of those sounds from the same series of instruments, but very distinct and different sounds. So let's start off by talking about this first principle that I mentioned, or this first characteristic, which is frequency of the instrument. Right off the bat, let me just define sort of the go-to frequency spectrum that a warm pad is going to occupy, or at least the part of the frequency spectrum that gives a sound its warmth. Now this varies, and some people will debate it. It depends on your preferences and what your ear likes to hear the most, but most folks are going to attribute warmth to the frequency range between around 200 and 500 hertz. And you can see we've got low end energy here, we've got some upper mid range and up to the high, especially as that pad fades in. But right here in the middle, we've got this 200 to 500 hertz range. So I've got this bandpass here, and watch what happens if I'm holding this out, and then I just cut that frequency range. So here it is without. this is still a really cool sound. It's a great pad. It's got interesting low end, interesting high end, but it's not warm anymore. If we add this frequency range back in, then that warmth is really present. So as an example here, let's talk about why this specific frequency range contributes that feeling of warmth. Think about your kick drum and your bass, which are going to be generally lower or right up to about that 200 hertz range of the frequency spectrum. Then up above 500 hertz, you have things like the hi-hat, you have cymbals, you have your vocalist with all of the character coming between 1K and 2K. You've got sizzle and brightness all the way up above that, and you've got your lead electric guitars sort of sharing space with the vocals. And then here in the lower mids is where you have rhythm instruments like electric guitar, maybe certain aspects of the acoustic guitar, depending on the style of the player. And we have all of this room for us as keys players to fill this low mid-range space. So there's really this frequency spectrum carved out for the keys role, or even specifically for pads, because it's above the low end and it's below pretty much everything else other than rhythm instruments. So this works so well, and that's why we see pads described as, and we use pads as glue so often, because the drums and the bass lay down a foundation, and then a really great warm pad can just sort of cover over the top of that, encapsulate the foundation laid by the rhythm section, and then everything else just stands right on top of that without being hampered or hindered by what the pad is doing. So to use this a little bit more as an example, I can cut the lows, and that pad still sounds warm. I can cut the highs, and that pad still sounds warm. It changes the character of the instrument, and that's the next thing we're going to talk about, but it's still serving in that sort of glue role. Okay, so this is another awesome patch in Omnisphere called Basic Dark Pad. This one's really cool because it combines a Juno sample and a classic OB sample that the mod wheel brings in. So let's look at the frequency range again here. With the mod wheel down, we're right there in that sweet spot. And even as we play higher on the keyboard, we're still largely in that range. It's not till we get up several octaves above sort of the middle of the keyboard that we start to get up above that. So as long as we stay here in this space, we are largely filling that sort of glue. I'll bring the mod wheel up so you can hear the character of that OB synth come in. So we're adding more brightness with the mod wheel. We've got some low end going on, but again, it's that warm, low, mid frequency space that's really defining or making the sound what it is. We can cut the highs, we can cut the lows, the pad stays warm because of the frequency range that it plays in. Okay, so now let me show you a couple more examples of these types of warm pad sounds. Maybe you don't have Omnisphere. I'm going to use a couple of patches from the warm category of Sunday Keys 2021. So if you have Sunday Keys, these patches are available to you. So I've gone to the pad category and then actually sorted by warm pads. These pads are available in the Ableton Live and MainStage formats. So just because I'm in MainStage doesn't mean you can't use these in Ableton Live. So this is warm pad 1, which is a real meat and potatoes kind of pad. And right there is that warmth between 200 and 500 hertz. Let's load in another one. Here's warm choir pad. This is a very different sounding instrument, but it's still filling that same sort of frequency range between 200 and 500 hertz. So this warm choir pad is a really good transition into the second characteristic, which is the timbre or character of the sound and how that impacts whether or not the pad is actually going to be perceived as warm. Just because a sound fills that 200 to 500 hertz frequency range doesn't mean that it's automatically going to feel warm, because if a sound is super raspy or if it has lots of high frequency content in addition to that mid-range, then it might not necessarily feel like a warm pad, even though that frequency range is being taken up. So here, this warm choir pad still fits the bill compared to warm pad 1. It's a very different sound. You've got a little extra brightness. But because of the character of the instrument, it still would serve really, really well as that sort of glue. But let's go here and I'm gonna load in this glimmer pad, which is in the thin and airy pad category. So this instrument still sits in that sort of frequency range between 200 and 500 hertz. And I guess depending on your preference, you could say that there's warmth in this instrument. But for me, this pad doesn't necessarily sit as far back in the mix by default because of what's going on right above that 500 hertz range. Between 500 and 2K, we have a lot of harmonic activity that's giving the instrument its character. It's making it sound thin and airy, which is really cool. And sometimes you need that kind of pad sound. But for me, if I'm going for a default meat and potatoes sort of warm sound, I like there to be a really strong contrast between that 200 to 500 hertz range and the frequency spectrum immediately above that, from 500 to about 2K. And for this, there's a good bit of activity happening there that I think sort of separates it a little bit more from being a good default warm pad sound. So the character or timbre of the instrument overall contributes a lot to the feeling or the perception of warmth. It's not just about frequency space, but frequency space combined with the character and timbre of the instrument. So next, let's talk about why pads work so well in a mix, even in layered patches for us as keys players. So I'm gonna go back to this warm pad 1 here. Bring up my EQ again. So we're right here in 200 to 500 hertz. It sounded really nice. I can bring the mod wheel up and introduce that brightness if I'd like without sacrificing that frequency range. Now I'm gonna go to Sunday Grand from Sunday Keys 2021. I'm gonna play the exact same chords. Now most piano instruments or electric piano instruments are gonna be sort of full-bodied. They're gonna take up a lot of frequency space across the range of notes that are played. And you can see here I've got some of that piano signal in this 200 to 500 hertz range. That's sort of the body or resonance of the piano. And then I've got some of the harmonic interest and the defining characteristic of the piano happening above that. So now let's go to a layered patch where I've combined Sunday Grand and the warm pad together using Patch Builder. So now check this out. So this is really that sort of glue foundational element that warm pads can bring to a mix that I talked about a little bit earlier in the video, because both of the instruments share that frequency space of 200 to 500 hertz, and the piano sits on top with some of that harmonic complexity that makes it sound like a piano. The warm pad just stays constant there. As the piano body decays, the pad sort of takes over to the listener, which makes it feel like the piano is doing more than it would do on its own, while still being largely piano driven. This is why warm pads work so well, and why it's important to dial in a good warm pad sound for these types of layered patches. If I bring the mod wheel up here, and this is my default, when I have that extra brightness, then it starts to sound like both instruments are sort of sharing space, instead of the pad being a support for the piano. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing in all circumstances, but when we're talking about a large chunk of modern worship music, we really want that piano instrument to be the lead instrument, to be the hero of the song. And then the warm pad sits underneath and supports what you are doing with piano and what the rest of the band is doing around the parts that you're playing. Next, we're going to talk about the third characteristic, which is a really important one, spatialization. Now, again, this is a big word that just means how big or wide or dense a sound feels. So to talk about this, I wanted to first just open up the initialized RetroSynth preset here inside of MainStage. It sounds like this. So we can see this here in our EQ. Now, if we just went off of the EQ or the frequency spectrum that I've been talking about so far in this video, we'd think, you know, this is probably a warm sound because it's sitting in that frequency range. We could even cut out some of the low end right below it to let that really shine. So it's taking up that 200 to 500 hertz frequency range. But to me, I don't know to you, but at least to me, this isn't really a sound that I would describe as warm. And I wanted to use this example because it's a very stark example of what a lack of spatialization or a lack of depth or complexity can do to keep a sound from feeling warm, from feeling sort of dense and deep and cozy like a blanket, to get really cheesy. So how can we make a sound like this go from feeling sort of static or not dense at all to making it feel warmer when the frequency space is already being taken up, but it just doesn't feel like it's doing what we would want a warm pad to do? So I'm going to take my EQ up here on my second monitor. We're going to do this inside of the plugin by adding some complexity. So we can do this in a number of different ways. Let's change this to a square wave and add some pulse width modulation via the LFO. This is a classic technique for warming up a pad sound. So we can adjust the rate via the LFO to add a little bit of motion, a sense of space to the sound. Next, we can make drastic changes here by changing up the voice detune of the instrument. And this type of setting is going to be available in whatever synthesizer you're working in. So watch what happens when I bring up the detune. There we go. And then I could stack more voices in unison. So now the other thing that I can do here is carve out a little bit more space to accent the warmth of the instrument. You look at all the low end on the initial attack here. You can see all of that happening and it's fading out. So we could hack that off with EQ if we wanted, but for a pad sound, oftentimes you want a slower attack. So I'm going to increase the attack length up to about 1400 milliseconds, so just over a second. Now we're really starting to feel like this is what we would say is a pad sound. Now, let's bring the filter cutoff down. I'm going to bring that up over time via the filter envelope. We're going to match the time here of the amp envelope. And then we'll let it decay a little bit more slowly over time. So that little bit of resonance in the filter is giving it a little bit of a nose, a little bit of bite. But it's not stepping so far outside of that warm frequency spectrum so as to take over the characteristic of the sound. And if I wanted to make sure of that, I could apply a little bit of a cut right here. There we go. Nice. Okay, now I can play with the amount of vibrato to add some pitch modulation over time, which is another thing that can add a sense of space, a sense of depth. Then I can, of course, also add in this second oscillator here and detune it as well. I'm going to bring up the release time here as well so that there's a smoother fade between these chord changes. And then lastly, let's add some chorus modulation here inside the plugin. So here we've really addressed all three things that we've talked about as characteristic of a warm pad. We've made sure that the frequency spectrum is being intentionally chosen for this instrument. So we're really shooting for that 200 to 500 hertz range. Next, we've played around with the oscillator choices here, going with pulse modulation for this square wave, and then bringing in a detuned saw wave on the second oscillator, and we're applying some pitch vibrato as well to give it a very unique sort of timbre. And we also have the filter cutoff being modulated by the filter envelope with a good bit of resonance in there to sort of add that little bit of nose to the attack. And then thirdly, we've made sure that things sound nice and wide, nice and dense, well spatialized by adding some chorus modulation, some voice stacking, and detuning all of those voices. So this is not a groundbreaking worship pad. This is a very generic worship pad sound, I would say. But I think it's a good representation of where we started being in that frequency space, but not having the character of a warm pad at all, to making just a couple minutes worth of tweaks with some intentional targets to shoot for, and how big of a difference that can make in warming up any sound. Now, you don't have to just apply these principles to pads. Any instrument that you want to sound warm can benefit from these principles. So lastly, let's just put a little extra polish on this instrument by adding a nice bit of reverb here. I'm going to use the Silver Verb plugin. You can get very similar results inside of the reverb plugin in Ableton Live. I'm going to modulate this reverb a bit. Bring the mod wheel back down so that filter stays nice and closed. And then lastly, to spatialize or spread this out just a little more, I really love to add an instance of stereo delay that only emphasizes the high end. And I'm going to have this feed into itself here inside of the plugin, so these repeats sort of bounce back and forth a little bit chaotically. What this is going to do is it's really only going to be audible on that little bit of resonant nose that we've applied to the attack. As the sound fades in, it's going to wash that swell out a little bit so it doesn't sound quite as aggressive, and it gets spread out in the stereo field, which makes it feel a little less prominent, but at the same time also a little bit bigger, a little bit more powerful. So now we've got this warm pad that has paid attention to the frequency spectrum. We've intentionally dialed in the character and timbre of the instrument, and we've made sure that it's dense enough to feel like it's taking up the appropriate amount of space. So there's two more things that I want to talk about really quickly in terms of that third characteristic, which is the spatialization or density of a sound. Some folks might use the term lushness there to describe a pad, and I think that's a pretty good descriptor, because when you think of lushness, you think of things having a good bit of density, like a lush garden or a lush forest with lots of things going on that are all very similar, but there's a surrounded feeling to that. And I think that's really what you're going for when you're trying to dial in a well-spatialized or dense pad sound when you're shooting for a warm pad. And then the last thing I want to emphasize is when you're starting from scratch, like we just did inside of RetroSynth, you cannot count on the plugin or the sample or the oscillators that you're working with to give you that 200 to 500 hertz frequency space easily or automatically. Now, we spoiled ourselves a little bit by starting off inside of Omnisphere 2. The presets inside of Omni are so well dialed in right out of the gate that it is really easy to get amazing results from the stock presets alone. But if you're working inside of the initialized preset of a specific plugin, you have to make the sound design choices and the EQ choices to sort of respect and carve out that bit of the frequency spectrum. Because a lot of the oscillators, a lot of the samples that you're going to find inside of other plugins that aren't preset or ready to play focused are going to be much more full voiced. So you're going to have lots of low end. You have to watch out for boom down there. You're going to have lots of sizzle, lots of high end, lots of upper mids that can get in the way of your vocals or your electric guitar. It's really important for you to sort of fight back all of the potential from those sounds to emphasize only the ones that you intentionally want to highlight. Okay guys, so in the comments, I'd love to hear from you with more tips that you like to go to when you're designing worship pads of your own, specifically warm pads. And I'm gonna put the patch I designed, the warm pad here that we just worked on in this video. We're gonna upload it to the Patch of the Week archives for all our newsletter subscribers. So if you're not already subscribed to the newsletter, there's a link in the description. When you sign up, you'll get a new worship patch in your inbox every Wednesday, along with an immediate download of over hundreds of ready-to-play worship patches all dialed in for you. So leave a comment if you liked this video. We'd love it if you gave it a thumbs up. That's a great way to support the channel and help us to release more videos like this one. Thanks for watching. Go check out the free patch and have a great day.